Luke chapter 1, verse 5. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah or Abijah. And his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. They had no child, because that Elizabeth was barren, and they were both now well stricken in years. Let me stop there, because we're going to revisit this passage a little bit later in the message, but I just want you to look at something. Remember, we started last week by carefully reading out of Matthew's gospel. Not that they saw a star, they saw his star. Those little words that become really important when you're reading, which we can read right by. Here is another one. Luke, just like Matthew, mentions the mention of the days of Herod, king of Judea. And as I noted last week, we can know that the writing is in the right period because Judea went through several different names. This would have been the name of this place during this period of writing between Matthew and Luke. Then you also have, as I said, the mention of Herod, a priest named Zacharias. All this seems like nebulous information. Why do we need it? But in here, in this small little passage, the information for people to properly at least begin reckoning the date of Christ's birth. Why? Because Zacharias and Elizabeth would become the parents of John the Baptist, and the chronicle of this was by brilliant design, not by mistake, not by let's be verbose. There's details in here that are actually mind-blowing. So a priest named Zacharias of the course of Abijah, as I said, you know what, well, I'm going to revisit this later because I want to spend some time talking about this. But just the mention of which course that Zacharias served in, and that his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, which tells you this is a very pedigreed family. This is not your average group of people here. He had to be of a certain lineage to be able to serve as priest, and she's from the daughters of Aaron. So they both have some fancy pedigree in terms of the Bible. Now, the reason why I start here is to show something. The mention of Herod, the mention of the proper name of Judea at the time of the writing, and the people that are mentioned in here. All important details if we're going to try and pinpoint, at least try and get close to the date of Christ's birth. Now, I said this closing my message. I will say it now to open the message. Understanding which year Christ was born in is not going to affect your salvation, okay? So if somebody says he was born in 8 BC or he was born in 4 BC or years in between, that's not going to affect your salvation. But what is important is recognizing that his birth must actually line up with one of the feasts that are laid out in the Old Testament. Because everything about those feasts, see, people tend to look at the Old Testament and say, well, this wasn't the old system. But it was never an old system. It was a system of shadows and types. And in the Old Testament, they used we'll call it, what would be the, suppose, not yet that we see in the New Testament, which is what is in Christ. But everything back there, when we talk about it, is not some old, antiquated. In this respect, it all points to Christ. And a careful analysis, as we've already done, of the tabernacle and of its contents explains that. In fact, this is the conversation sometimes I have with people who are talking about the temple that's to be built and fail to recognize that there's missing furniture in that tabernacle for a reason, because if those things represented Christ, Christ no longer has to come a second time as sacrifice. He no longer, there's certain things he's already fulfilled. When he comes, he returns as King of Kings, not as the sacrificial lamb. So a lot of times people get all of this flow mixed up. And as I said, my burden in life is to try and untangle it and make it comprehensible. So I'm going to abandon this text right now. We have to come back to it later in the message because we're going to look at that particular passage. But while we're in Luke, I want you to turn to the second chapter. And in the second chapter, we have a little bit different approach than Matthew's gospel. Second chapter, it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now, if you look carefully, if you have a Bible like mine, taxed in the margin is enrolled. Epo or epographe. Greek confirms that. It's enrolled, it's not taxed. So there was some type of census being done. And the verbiage here is very misleading, but okay. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth in Judea, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Now, let me just stop right there. This is something that people, again, read right over, which is Joseph returning to the city of David, and very carefully it says here, returning to the city of Bethlehem because he was of the house and lineage of David. Why does this matter? Well, again, because people talk about this and tend to paint Joseph as irrelevant in the equation and focus and highlight on Mary. Well, the fact of the matter is that they did not obviously have sexual relations to conceive Jesus. But what I'm asking you to pay attention to is very interesting. It says he went to the city called Bethlehem, house and lineage of David. And if you have been following me any amount of time, we traced the lines of both Joseph and Mary. And in that descending passage, right at the time of around Zerubbabel, there is a split that takes both Joseph's line and Mary's line and basically comes back down to bring us Christ. So they actually both fit into the lineage, all right, which again is important information. Some people just paint Joseph as this add-on. He's not. Also, as I said, they did not produce Jesus the normal way, the biblical way, but other children were had after that, which had to have been done the old-fashioned way, right? So the point I want to pick up here is that we know that Caesar Augustus ruled from 31 BC to 14 AD. That mention right there of a decree that went out from Caesar Augustus. So we have a window and a timeline. Remember, we've already looked at the timeline of Herod. And I don't care, again, we're not here to try and pinpoint a year so much as looking at a space and time, which a lot of people have tried to kind of wedge in somewhere. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to show you there's a lot of ways to look at this to try and wrap your mind around it. So we know Herod, for example, dies in 4 BC. Now, if that date for Herod's death is real and accurate, then two things. One, we know Jesus had to have been born before Herod's death, correct? Right? Because Herod issued the decree that all children 2 years and under in that particular area should be put to death, focused on trying to eliminate the Christ child. So we know Christ had to have been born, if we're going to use Herod's dating, before the death of Herod. We know that this decree would have been issued sometime around 8 BC. This decree that we're looking at, the decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. But what's not spoken of or said properly is that this particular enrollment, however you want to understand it, didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was almost 30 years in the making. Failed attempts to actually rightly chronicle the populace, their vocation, their earnings, their possessions, and what have you. So there is typically on the part of most scholars and most people that read this will conflate and make a one event out of this. There were several enrollments, there were several taxations, and then there was also something else. There was, independent of all this, there was a time when every person had to pledge an oath to Caesar. And that was done independent of the enrollment or the census or taxation. That was done by design. And people who did not willingly or willfully take the oath to Caesar faced pretty bad consequences. So this is all kind of in this scope, and I think that is really important. But if you've studied this subject even a little bit, Tertullian, for example, he says, the census taken in Judea under Augustus was done by Sentius Saturninus, and the ancient writer Suidas stated that Caesar Augustus, having chosen 20 men of the greatest ability, sent them all into all the countries of all the nations and caused them to register every man and his possessions. So think about it. It's at this time, the time in Luke 2, that people are returning to their hometowns to register. And this is what this looks like. Now, if Herod was required to comply with these instances of census, taxation, enrollment, whatever you want to call it, it would have been done under Augustus. However, Herod would have been given the license to collect in a way that would have been a little bit more favorable with the populace. Remember, Herod was hated by the people, so he would periodically ingratiate himself to accomplish these purposes by kind of bending to the ways of the people during that period. It's what politicians do, right? We're not ignorant of that. But there's something strange here, and I'm going to tell you, I may be pointing out more oddities today than things that add up. So here's the thing. If the people had to go to their hometown, as we read about Joseph going to Bethlehem, because he is of the house and lineage of David, and Mary is with him, there's two things I want to look at. First is Joseph would not have had to obey the Roman custom of presenting himself for taxation at his residence, but would have been required to return to his place of origin, which is what we're reading. Most people think people just went to pay the tax somewhere. No, they had to report to what they identified as their hometown. That's number one. Number two, why did Mary, you could say, okay, of course she went with him. That's his wife, right? But let's just say, for the sake of this conversation and reading what's here, when it says being great with child, doesn't make that much sense unless you have to present yourself in person, which is, we can speculate that. What we do know is that men would have been required at about the age of 14 to report and to enroll or to be counted. And women, believe it or not, from the age of 12 onward, we don't have any more information. And anybody who says they have more information is just speculation. We don't have any more specifically to this event. So this, what I just said, is not without problem. Why? Because if you read in verse 2 when it says, and this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, there may be some time issues there, and a lot of people have tried to make it work. I'm just actually going to point out the things that may be in slight contradiction, all right? So this is what we know. The historical data shows that Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until 6 AD. That's a problem. Yeah, okay. He was consul in 12 BC, but just not of that area. So there's a question mark there. That's something I'm not going to die on a hill about. It's not going to affect my salvation. It's just question mark, okay? At some point between 12 BC and 1 AD, he was engaged, this Cyrenius was engaged with a Cilician tribe, so we can know that Quirinius presided over the first wave of the enrollment, if you want, that had taken place. I'm just not so sure of how it was carried out because it would have been done under Herod the Great. And again, remember I said to you, Herod had a way of ingratiating himself to the population. He didn't come across as, this is Rome's taxation or enrollment. He manipulated the people. So I'm not quite sure how that would have been done. That's a question mark right there. And then the second census was under one of Herod's sons. We have the second census, just a blip in passing, just something that goes by like that. You wouldn't even think to classify it as such. I'll read it to you in, let's see here. In Acts, I'll read it, don't turn there. In Acts 5:37, it says, after this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of taxing and drew away much people. That in the days of the taxing, that is the second census in Acts 5:37. Just a blip, just poof, all right? But that's the second census that occurs. Now, in Matthew's writing, he says that Herod was still on the throne at the time of Christ's birth. But listen to what Josephus, the writer, Antiquity of the Jews, all of those writings, he says, Herod's illness came more and more acute, for God was inflicting just punishment upon him for his lawless deeds. He had a mild fever, apparently some sort of skin condition that made him want to rip his skin off. For the amount of inflammation and itchiness that covered his whole body, he suffered from some terrible bowel disorder, intestinal pain, gangrene of his private parts. As some have hypothesized that due to all of this sickness, this is why Herod could not see the star that is referenced in Matthew's gospel. But I don't think so. I think that that's human rationalizing, and I think the answer is of a spiritual nature. I think that he did not have spiritual eyes to see, therefore God did not let him see, okay? And I also, just on that note, I'll tell you, because there's more to this star, I think that it's really important to understand that the things we think we understand, I think those wise men understood clearly. And even with all the wealth of information we have, we probably don't have the complete picture that they were looking at. That's what I think. All right, so most of the information that we have about Herod comes to us from Josephus. We know that Herod's reign began at the death of his predecessor, Antigonus. So most of the available information between the census that I'm talking to you about in Luke 2, which would have been 8 BC, and the death of Herod the Great, 4 BC, we can say that there is a definite window of certainty, okay, between 8 BC and 4 BC. But what we can conclude probably even easier than this, and I'm saying this in a more opinionated way, it's highly unlikely that this 8 BC census concluded within that year the birth of Jesus, although it's possible. Equally so, if Herod died in 4 BC, the likelihood that Christ's birth occurred before then, we would most likely say, if you're going to look, push the two dates together and end up somewhere in the middle. That seems to be a logical conclusion, somewhere around 7 or 6 BC for the date of Christ. But you must analyze everything. In what is called the Megillah Tanit, there is a list of Jewish set times that appear, and what's interesting is that fasting at certain times in this book, the dates are considered prohibited. You are not allowed to fast on certain days. And this list was compiled before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. 2 dates. One is 7 Kislev, the other one is 2 Shebat. And supposedly these 2 dates commemorate, one, the death of Herod, and the other, the death of Jannai, the important rabbi. So why do I say that's important? Because that will play into, if these dates are legitimate, that will play into dating, if we know the month that Jesus was born, these dates can help us establish other facts. So that's why I said it's important to keep an open mind. We can also assume from both Matthew and Luke that after fleeing to Egypt, Joseph and Mary, with Jesus in tow, returned to their home after an angel had told them, basically, the coast is clear and that old sucker's dead. Come back, right? The danger's over. So we're looking at this 5th verse, and it was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah, or we know it better as Abijah. Now in 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 through 19, you can read about the 24 courses of the priesthood. And basically how this worked back then, not that there was a lottery. You had to be in line. Your lineage determined whether or not you would serve. You were assigned 1 week. In the service, for example, the course of Abijah would be the 8th course in service, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So starting at the first course, which would have begun on the first Sabbath of the first Sabbath of Nisan, and then the second week, the second course, and so on. But the only problem there is that Passover, Pentecost, and there's one more. Everybody served. It wasn't like one priest for that week. They all served. So what we know is that service of the 24 courses is there in 1 Chronicles 24. It also lays out the holidays where everybody served, and then they would start all over again. So basically you'd have 2 times 24, 48, and the rest of it filled in by those high feast set times where everyone served. So what happened? The people living in the land get deported and carried away. And we read that when they came back from Babylonian captivity, that would be in Nehemiah 12, when they returned, there were only 4 divisions that returned of all. Only 4. These 4 were redivided into 24 to carry out the prescribed method of worship. So the transition from 1 Chronicles, which was complete, and then the people were carried away, not everybody returned. So of those that did, 4 divisions return. Those 4 divisions are redivided into 24 to begin the service. And this is how we know Zacharias of the course of Abijah, by the time of Christ, they were still doing this service. So think about it. From the time they came back from captivity, and there could have been some interruptions with different things, like maybe in the intertestamental period there were some wars or some outbreaks, some riots, but the course of the priest never changed after that time. So when it chronicles that Zacharias of the course of Abiah or Abijah, a person who's trained in this book knows right away Zacharias was serving in the 8th course. That's number 1. Number 2, as I said, the first course would have started on the first Sabbath of the month of Nisan. And Zacharias serving the 8th course would have started serving, hear me out, on the 9th week, because Passover occurred on the 3rd. So that's when everybody served, remember? So I'm trying to show you there'd be gaps in time. If you were trying to make this constant flow, you have to account for what? Passover, Pentecost, and what else? Tabernacles. I knew there was one missing. All right. So we have the other mention here, that Elizabeth was barren, and they were both now well stricken in years. We know that Zacharias prayed to have a child. So again, here is another, I could do a message in a message, but it's really very analogous to the way God looks at people that are faithful in following him. You look at Abraham and Sarah, or you look at Isaac, and all of these barren folks, right? And they plead and they petition, and then God does something for them in answering their prayers. So surely we know here, as Zacharias served, the angel Gabriel visited him, told him that his wife Elizabeth would soon have a child, and his name would be John. Now, I don't know about you, but I always have these little cartoon reels that go on. I imagine Zacharias serving in the temple and being freaked out because what the hell is this thing, right? This angel. We think of angels as sweet and lovely. I think they probably have more of a striking, scary appearance, but that's just my opinion. And then on top of that, some stranger is telling you your wife's going to have a child. Nothing wrong with that, right? I don't know. Okay, never mind. So when it was Zacharias' service was complete, he returned home to his wife, and she conceived. And they did it the old-fashioned way, okay? There was nothing remarkable about how she got pregnant. We know that Elizabeth hid herself for the first 5 months of her pregnancy, and in the 6th month of her pregnancy, the angel Gabriel returns to visit the young virgin named Mary. So we have a timeline even in the Word. We have a timeline that's crystal clear, nothing ambiguous. We'll read it in a second. And what's remarkable is that, again, take a look at this. We can know what time Zacharias was serving in the temple. We can know, because courses would align with specific times, so we could narrow down when he was serving, when he finished his service, which would have been at the end of that week, that he went home, that Elizabeth conceived, and now we're talking about the fact that for the first 5 months she hid herself, but in the 6th month we have this conversation where the angel visits Mary. And that is, again, by design, so that we can know that by the time John the Baptist is born, we've got a couple-month gap, and then Christ is born. And all of this is not in here for random storytelling. You can actually, if you think about what I'm saying, thousands of years of the church reading this, the same thing we're reading, and yet refuse to rightly put the date of Christmas or the date of Christ's birth, forget about Christmas, the date of Christ's birth in proper perspective. So it's kind of baffling to me. I mean, we've all here looked at this passage at least once or twice, some of us maybe a couple dozen times. There's nothing in here that would tell you December. There's nothing in here that would say anything except there are clear dates. And it's as though most of the church world says, yeah, I know, but I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear anything you're saying. Why? Because that would upset the apple cart somehow? Who would stand to lose if for some reason we could actually put the date out there and say, and I'm going to just tell you right now so you're not sitting there going, come on already. Jesus had to have been born in September. The fulfillment of the feasts that occur in September. He must actually return. No one knows the day or the hour, but he must return within that same set time. So you might ask, what's so remarkable about December of all months to place it there? And I told you last week, if you want to do the research, if you don't want to do the research, you take my word for it, or you can call me a liar. But there was no Christmas celebration before sometime in the 350, 354, 356, between 2 years. And if you go back into the church fathers, you've got Tertullian hypothesizing one date, and you've got Epiphanius espousing another date. So it's not as though everybody fell in line and said, oh yes, it's December 25th. In fact, if you look at the church fathers, there's some really good, we'll call it logic, for them to be trying to sort this date out. But the one that is completely non-logical and has zero connection to anything, please, if you are a person who understands the set times of the Jewish feast, is there anything at all, anything, push Hanukkah out of the way for a second, is there anything in this book, set time, that occurs on December 25th for the Jewish people in their celebration? So God doesn't just pull things out of whole cloth. And remember what I said, the Old Testament, you need the Old Testament and you need the New Testament because they unfold and explain each other. So the set times that are fixed in the Old Testament are applied to Christ and have everything to do with him. He is our Passover. Do you think it's an accident that he was crucified as our Passover? The preparation, John's Gospel says, as they were preparing for the Passover. And then what happened right after that? Jesus was crucified. He is, as Paul says, our Passover. And when we talk about, for example, the Feast of Pentecost, and what happened on the day of Pentecost, a fulfillment of that set time. So it's so frustrating to stand here and put it out there as clear as day. And you might say, well, but you haven't given a clear year yet. Well, I may not even do that. We have a window, and that window it gets smaller and smaller when you look and you see 8 BC to 4 BC. And what about those people that say, oh boy, you're going to hate me for this. If Jesus was born, do some math. If Jesus was born, let's just say in 7 BC, doesn't that alter everything that everyone has said about the age of Christ when he was crucified? And I've always had this is the way my brain works, I've always had a problem with this. There are too many internal things said to Christ. Oh, Luke says about the age of 30, and I think he says that very loosely. But here's my problem. There are other internal evidences that would suggest, along with the date I just gave you, that maybe he might have been a little bit older. You know, they have these very loose things with ages in the Bible, and yet here we come and we want to apply our methods to the Bible. So I said, just don't get into that hardcore, it can't be possible, because as you begin to look at the evidence, you realize it is fraught with problems. And I'm not standing here embarrassed to say that. You know, I'm a defender of the faith. I sometimes engage in apologetics. I am not afraid to say here, there are things that don't add up. They don't make me doubt my faith. They actually, in many ways, they help me to understand that if you were really trying to make this into a flawless book, everything would line up perfectly. There'd be no discrepancies. There'd be no, how could that be? So that, to me, adds to the validity of its veracity, not the other way around. Now, let me go back to the message. So, Mary then visits Elizabeth, as you know, stays with her for 12 weeks, and she leaves before John is born. That tells us that John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus. Furthermore, if we can date the birth of John the Baptist's conception and birth, that should help us get a little closer to Christ's birth date, correct? Or at least one would think that, correct? Yeah, okay. All right. Can see, I don't know, I maybe left some of you in the train station there. All right, John the Baptist would have been a late March baby. Jesus, being 6 months younger, would have been born in mid-September. Now, you might ask, what else could we look at other than reading the passage? And I'm going to see, if we have time, I'll come back to reading the passage, but I don't want to run out of time. I would say to you there are other internal evidences, some of that have already been mentioned here, about the time, the month or the time of year. And one of them occurs in Luke 2, and that is about the shepherds and the angels. In Luke 2:8, it says, "And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night," or the night watches of the flocks. And so we got a couple of things to discuss here. Again, let's go back into what most people do. It's a caricature. They believe that in the Holy Land, there's no snow, it can't get cold, it doesn't rain. I don't know what planet you live on, but do a little bit of Googling or something later and educate yourself. That's absolutely not true. It can get really cold. They can have massive rains, and yes, it can snow. So never say never there. But what we have to ask, which has been asked here already, but I want you to consider something. It says that shepherds were abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. Now, it's possible, and some have hypothesized, that these shepherds and their specific flocks were taking them kind of in a way to be sacrificed. They were taking them somewhere to be sacrificed. And that's just speculation to me. There's no proof of that. It says simply that they were keeping watch over their flock. My problem with this story is this. If you've ever had livestock or you've seen livestock, you don't just go, okay, it's bad weather, so we're not going out today, so everybody stays in the barn. it doesn't work like that. You do have to take your animals out and make sure that they're fed, they're watered, that they can roam a little bit to do whatever it is they need to do. And these would have, we're going to say, maybe possibly been sacrificial animals. But the important thing to kind of look at is, would you have your animals that are destined to be slaughtered out in the cold where possibly they could become defective due to injury or anything else? And the answer is no, you wouldn't. Okay? So then the next question which has been asked here is, would you keep sheep? If we're talking about the month of December, would you be keeping or tending your sheep out at night in the month of December? It's not impossible, but the likelihood of that is not too good. And the better likelihood is that this event is not being chronicled in December, but rather at the time we're talking about, which is early fall. That is, for all intents and purposes, when you would probably see this type of thing, not in the middle of winter. There's something else that's said here, though, which is kind of interesting. So you've got the shepherds, and then you've got an angel of the Lord. It's always interesting when you throw in an angel of the Lord, right? So you've got an angel of the Lord that came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. Again, small pieces of information that give credibility. You know, if they said the angels were around them and they were just backslapping, happy, hanging out, we're having a bro moment, you know, I'd say, yeah, but it seems to me that would be logical. They were afraid. And again, if we have a right image of what these angels might look like, I don't think it's that fluffy, cherubic-looking baby. I think these are a little bit more powerful-looking. I'll just leave it like that, all right? The angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you, ye shall find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. I have a question. Interesting, the angel tells this to the shepherds. Now, it doesn't say they're mathematicians or they're astronomers, they're shepherds, okay? So I'm trying to say something without saying it. They may not have been book-smart people, right? So the angel's talking to them and says, you know, you'll see a sign. You'll see a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly, there was with the angel a multitude of heavenly hosts praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, Gee, what the heck was that? No, they said, Let us go now unto Bethlehem, even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which has come to pass, which the Lord hath made known unto us. And they came with haste, found Mary, Joseph, and the babe lying in the manger. So it's kind of interesting. This is a lot of storytelling to include random people that have no rhyme or reason in the story. I want you to think about this. If you're inventing something, it could be a cool invention to add a couple of shepherds and a couple of crazy angels, or it happened that way. And it's as crazy as that seems, it happened that way. And I believe it happened that way. When they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told to them concerning this child. And all they that heard it wondered at those things which were told to them by the shepherds. So again, it says the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen as it was told unto them. So kind of an interesting passage right there. And as I said, the reason why I think even this part of the story, we don't know the shepherd's name, we don't know how many people, but just simple people exposed to something supernatural, an angel saying, this is what's going on, this is what's happening, go check it out. Now imagine if they made that pilgrimage to go check out, go see this babe in swaddling clothes, and they get there and there's nothing. But the record says that they saw Mary, Joseph, and the babe lying in the manger. So this is one where I'd say to you, is this a hard proof? Is this something where you'd say, I'm going to stake every claim on this? No. But again, the oddity of the way this is written, including strangers and concepts that had not yet really been built in to lay out the narrative, are put in here. So if you were analyzing this just the way it's written, just a writing analysis, gives you a good sense of actually a veracity, not anything else. But again, you've got to line up all of the internal things in here, not just one or two. All right, if we are still looking up, as I'm going to change subjects again, if we are still looking up, we went through the Gospels, the Gospel and the stars, we went through looking at briefly the Star of Bethlehem. So let's ask this question. I'm going to toss this in for good measure because I can. All right, so is it possible that what was seen in the sky was not a singular star? Could it have been a comet, a planet? Could it have been a constellation? Now, there's much written about this. So again, in your own time, there's no way that I could exhaust this subject here, but in your own time, there could have been a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, which many people have written about this. This is another one of these theories that if people will look into it, you'll see there's a lot of research, not from pastors, but from people who actually have spent their life, devoted their life to what's in the sky, have written abundantly on this subject. So the thought process here is that these two line up or look like they've lined up, Saturn and Jupiter. They look like they come together a few times in a year to form what's called a triple conjunction. And the reason why I introduce this here right now is to tell you that one of these took place. A triple conjunction took place in 7 BC. Remember, we're talking about between 8 and 4. So you want to be combing what happened between 8 and 4 BC on every level. Planetary, everything that you can look at. It's all going to be put in the pot as evidence. We toss out what's no good. We keep what is applied and verified. So one of these took place in 7 BC between May and December. Wow, that's a widespread, right? But most people believe that this particular triple conjunction occurred in the early fall, placing it sometime in September. One of the advocates for this theory, if you went to school in this country at least, hopefully you learned about Johannes Kepler. If you didn't, I don't know what to tell you. You never know. Listen, education in this country has changed a lot, right? So maybe I said a name to some folks, they'd go, what's Kepler? Look it up. But he eventually published a work on this very subject called Anno Natali Christi, the year of Christ's birth. So something to look into. I'm not suggesting that I believe what he wrote was accurate, but he wrote abundantly on it. And there are many books, for example, during this period and through into the 19th century. In fact, two scholars made a massive contribution to this subject on the Star of Bethlehem. One is Dr. Idler, and the other one is Dr. Pritchard, in something called Handbuch in der Mathematischen und Technischen Chronologie. I think I just said the Handbook of Mathematics and Technical Chronology. Maybe. All right. Don't ask. At least it's better than my Spanish, though. All right. So that one was published in 1825, and it attempted to calculate the birth of Christ. That's very interesting, though, taking into consideration the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Dr. Idler postulated that there were 3 conjunctions that occurred in 7 BC. One of them would have gotten the attention of the wise men. That was part of his hypothesis that fueled their pilgrimage. Pritchard, on the other hand, stated the following, and it's a quote. He said, "To no eye, however weak, could the planets have been diffused into one." So for Pritchard, this hypothesis could not be valid. Again, we're talking about people who have devoted their lives to this, not just a preacher in a 1-hour sermon. And that's what's important here. When I mention certain people, if you're interested in pursuing more, look up their work, and you'll find attached to their work there'll be hundreds of other pages and books written on the subject to tell you we can't even scratch the surface in an hour. It's that big of a work. So Idler's theory, however, held up, and most of the people who study this subject will conclude kind of what he did in a very abstract way. So if you finish reading his work, you realize what he was trying to say is that Saturn, he was suggesting, was a type. Saturn was a type of Yahweh, of God the Father, and that Jupiter was a type of Messiah, and they merged into one at that time, essentially being able to give the incarnate person on earth. That's basically his hypothesis. He also says that when the Magi had seen his star in the east, that they were specifically, in his hypothesis, they were specifically looking at Jupiter. I can't tell you because this is just what I'm reporting to you, all right? What is interesting, though, now tying this back to the wise men, remember I told you it's most likely that they came from Babylonia, that particular area, okay? So what's interesting is Jupiter, the planet, was associated in Babylonian culture as the highest achieving deity, if you will, of all the planets. So that's very important. And then that Saturn was the celestial identity of those identifying as Jews. This is kind of a weird thing because we don't necessarily associate astronomy with the Jewish people, but yet in their records, a central part of the constellation of Pisces, the region with both planets would reach their stationary points, was associated in Jewish writing with the Levant, specifically the Holy Land. So I don't know. Is that just a coincidence? Maybe. Can't say. So there's just so much information on this that it's almost impossible for somebody to say there's not enough information. It's the amount and volume of work that's been put out that you have to sift through. Why? Because you're going to find that everybody has tried to put a date. Everybody's tried to say it had to happen at this time. I'm not doing that. I'm telling you in a more generic way that Christ's birth had to coincide with one of the set times in the Old Testament, number one. And number two, going from the dating that we have from Luke's Gospel of John the Baptist, we know that Jesus had to be born in September. That narrows down the feast that you're looking at, doesn't it? Okay, thank you. All right, so more on this, a little bit more on this. We have to ask a question. And the question is, did Matthew, when he was writing, I'm going to say I have the answer for me, but I want you to answer it for yourself. When Matthew was writing, do you think he was writing according to the Holy Spirit's urging of what is written in Numbers 24 about the star that shall come forth out of Jacob? Do you think that that was in there and he was reminded of that because he would have been well versed in the Old Testament while he was writing about this star that he's chronicling that was seen? Could this be that? Could there be that connection, that scepter shall rise out of Israel scripture that basically identifies that particular alignment in the sky with the prophecy given in Numbers 24? That's a question. That's a question for you to examine and make your own decision with. I'm not going to weigh in on that right now. But I would propose that if Matthew fabricated any part of the narrative, he would have probably made it much more plausible. Yeah? I mean, think about it. If you're going to write, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a bunch of bogus stuff, right? I'm going to try and make it bogus believable, not bogus like, oh, come on, right? So there's a lot in there that if you're not a person of faith, this is what turns a lot of people away because they can't make sense. They're trying to humanly rationalize what can only be seen with spiritual eyes. Sorry, but that's just the way it is. So let's kind of start wrapping this up by saying, I think the star or the combination or the triple conjunction, but I'm actually leaning towards triple conjunction for other evidences, I believe was done not just in the realm of what we've looked at as the stars in the sky, but specifically within a position that would signify something momentous happening on earth, which I think is what these signs were. But as I said, if Matthew thought that this was miraculous, the star, there's nothing in the writing that says this is a strange happening or this is an oddity or it's a miracle star. Simply that they said they were following his star. So when I say there's nothing remarkable in the story, it means there's nothing that would leap out to say, oh, that sounds a little odd. Most likely, as I've said, the Magi, the wise men, had understanding of things beyond what we could possibly tap into in our day and age. I believe that. And I also think that they viewed whatever was happening in the sky for a long period of time. I don't think that this just came up. I think as many things in the sky could be forecasted, I think that they had forecasted or they had seen this as an event coming in the future at a certain time when things aligned. This event basically then made them do their pilgrimage to pay honor to the Christ child. So it's very clear, and I think just in the few things I've shed light on today, it's very clear that December 25th is not Christ's birthday. More plausible and likely, as I said, is a September date fitting into the set times of God. And more specifically, as I say, because that census mentioned in Luke 2 would have been 8 BC, Herod died in 4 BC, and I'd say the likelihood of Christ's birth occurring at the time exactly of the census is not likely. So I would even push that date to say between 7 and 4 BC, and 4 BC is not even a likely date because, again, we've got internal evidences. So you're kind of being pushed into this window between 7 and 6. And again, I'm not picking a date. I'm showing you there's a lot more to pick at. And when you start looking at all the other things that are there are other people that have made wonderful cases to say he had to have been born in 2 or 3 BC. But again, you follow into these problems of a date that doesn't line up historically, for example, with the dates that I've mentioned regarding the census on the 8th BC, does not match up with the death of Herod either. So you have a problem. And this is why I said, please don't get into this where you've got to pound your fist and you've got to go crazy and make some statement that we're not required to make. I'm not obliged to stand here and tell you, this is the error of most preachers, in fact, to want to be in the place where people feel like I must give an answer, therefore I'll say something. I don't have to give an answer. Christ lives. Christ is king. We know that he's born within this window. We're going to see if we can narrow it down even more. And if there are evidences that point to that, I'll jump on those. But that's a little window right there. More importantly, though, is understanding the time. And the time is a fulfillment of a set time. As I said, it will be a fulfillment when he returns of a set time. This is why people can talk about looking up at a certain time and they say, this is the time that Christ returns. Well, if you're following the set times, it's written. It is written in the book. And that's probably the most important thing I can say. The goal of these messages is to get people to take a second look, to do a little bit of digging, to not get into the mindset of saying, this is what I've been told or this is what I believe, but rather open your eyes up to see that even when we can't make something fit neatly into a box, that usually, my nature anyway, is I'm going to do more digging. I'm going to do a little bit more exploring. I'm going to look and probe more. Does it mean that I'm going to answer every single question? No. And I may walk away, typically I do, with more questions than answers. But in the big picture, there's one thing here that we can walk away with certainty about. You don't put this much evidence and this much work and this much labor into presenting someone who didn't live and who didn't exist. We're talking about the nuances that are included. I mean, what an elaborate scheme to paint something in such minuscule detail if it's all a lie. So the thing I'm saying to you is we're still on this journey, but what I want us to walk away with today is it's pretty clear for the people who want to look. There is enough internal evidences, including using the Old Testament and its set times to say God has already kind of put the pathway out there and shown us, thank God for including the course of Abijah, Zacharias' service, because that tells us unequivocally at what time this man was serving, at what time he would have conceived with his wife Elizabeth, and 6 months later, Jesus Christ, our Lord, is born, and that is not December 25th. I hope for the people out there listening to this that become shell-shocked after you've heard me repeat that 3-4 times today, that you come back and come back saying, I have to hear more, even if you don't agree with me. I have to hear more of what she's saying to fill in the blanks, because that's exactly how I started. I started as the person that was pounding their fist in complete and absolute ignorance and denial, because I had been told this thing and believed it my whole life. But the reality is what Jesus said really fits the bill right here. The truth is very liberating. When you find the truth out and you find that the truth of the matter is the truth does set you free. We are not bound by these pagan traditions and pagan rituals. And I've said this to you before, if you celebrate Christmas, I don't think God's going to strike you dead. I think it's more what I've said. I use Christmas, and I've always used Christmas as an excuse to reach out to those people who I normally wouldn't express gratitude or love for, or just an appreciation for. I use that time because everybody's doing it, so it's not weird if you do it then. And that sometimes can become the door that opens for people, because they think this is the time that Christ was born, to be a little bit more open to talking about God and the things of God, including His goodness, His kindness, and His mercy. If that's the door I have to take, I'll take it. I'm not telling you to stop celebrating or stop having a party. Just recognize what it is, and it's not part of this equation. It can be part of our world, because it is part of the world we live in. So you can't just say, well, I deny all of this. It's part of our world. People celebrate. Just know why you are not celebrating that day for that reason. And then you can have a party with your friends or people that don't yet know the Lord and maybe enlighten them. Although I'd say to you, probably not a good idea to do it around Christmas time. You'll never regain them as friends ever again. All right, so with that being said, folks, that is my message for today. I hope that the takeaway today is not how many things I left undone or how many questions I didn't answer. It's to show you that there's a lot of things that are difficult to navigate, and we cannot be dogmatic until we've taken in all of the material and all of the resources. And even then, we may not be able to come hardcore to a point, but we've at least looked at enough information that we can form certain conclusions based on biblical evidence, not on opinions, postulations, or hypothesis of the world. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.